Hello, boys and girls of grade 5. I am Miss Martina Archer Semple, and today for our science lesson, we're going to continue to look at tides, how the moon affects the tides. All right, at the end of our lesson today, our objective is to identify what is tide and identify the types of tide and identify why and how the tides occur. So please get out your pencils, get out your notebook, and please be at your best. Give it your all. All right. Tides. Tides are the rise and fall of sea levels caused by the combined effects of the gravitational force exerted by the moon and by the sun, and the rotation of the earth. Yes, tides are the rise and fall of sea levels caused by the combined effects of the gravitational forces exerted by the moon and the sun, and the rotation of the earth. Yes, on the illustration that we're seeing there, we're looking at where the sun is, the earth in the middle, the phases of the moon. So how and when do we get these different tides? Now at first quarter and new moon, we would have the spring tide, or we say high tide. After new moon, between new moon and first quarter, we're going to have nip tide, as we say, or low tide. Just after the third quarter, going on to full moon, we would have a spring tide again, or a high tide. After the full moon, going into the first quarter again, we will then experience another nip tide. So everywhere around the world experience 2 nip tide, or we say low tide, and 2 spring tide, or high tides. Spring tide. Sun and moon on the same side. So when the sun and the moon are on the same side, approximately twice a month, around new moon, when the sun, moon, and earth form a line. That tidal force due to the sun reinforces that due to the moon. And we have a picture there illustrating what we are talking about. So that is spring tide. Let's look at nip tide, or we say low tide. Sun and moon at 90 degrees. Now the illustration is showing you that directly halfway we will find the sunlight and we find the moon. And during when the sun and the moon is at 90 degrees, that's when we have a nip tide, or a low tide. When the moon is at first quarter, the sun and the moon are separated by 90 degrees. When viewed from the earth, and the solar tidal force particularly cancels the moons. At these points in the lunar cycle, the tide's range is at its minimum. That is when we have nip tide. And this is called nip tide or nips, or we say low tide. Spring tide. Sun and moon at opposite sides. It's at 180 degrees. Approximately twice a month around full moon, when the sun, moon, and earth form a line. The tidal force due to the sun reinforces that due to the moon. Then is when we have a spring tide or a high tide. The second one, the second set of nip tide, is when we have a full moon again. The sun and the moon is at 270 degrees. So it's almost completely around, but not fully around, almost. Okay? Remember, one complete cycle is 360 degrees, but the nip tide, the sun and the moon is at 270 degrees. When the moon is at third quarter, the sun and the moon are separated by 90 degrees. When viewed from the earth, and the solar tidal force particularly cancels the moons. At this point in the lunar cycle, the tides range is at its minimum, and this is called a nip tide or nips. Then we have the final spring tide, the third quarter moon. All right, remember, we can't get confused with these things. We have to pay attention closely. Remember the sun here, and then we have the third quarter of the moon. We have spring tide, where the sun and the moon are the same side. The cycle restarts. Approximately twice a month around new moon, when the sun, moon, and earth form a line. The tidal force due to the sun reinforces that due to the moon. In conclusion, tide is the gravitational pull of the moon on the earth and its water. The two types of tides are spring tide or high tide and nip tide or low tide. Spring tide or high tide occurs when the sun and the moon are pulling in the same direction. The spring tide or the high tide occurs when the sun and the moon are pulling in the same direction. Nip tide or low tide occurs when the sun and the moon are pulling in the different directions. Yes, nip tide or low tide occurs when the sun and the moon are pulling in the different directions on the earth. All parts of earth experiences 2 nip tides and 2 spring tides. Now, this would have brought us to the end of our session on nip tide and high tide. I hope you remember the difference between nip tide or low tide and spring tide or high tide. Again, remember, the sun and the moon pull in the same direction, and we have the high tide. The sun and the moon pull in different direction, and we have nip tide or low tide. Thank you very much. I hope you would have enjoyed and you would have understand a little better on tides and how and why and when they occur. This is Miss Martina Archer Semple saying bye for now.